good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm very excited to have with me a very old friend and colleague, Michael Fluhr, who's of Counsel at DLA. Michael, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Richard. By the way, it's an absolute honor to be here. I've seen some of your guests on the prior episodes, and I don't know where I fit in or how I ended up on that list, but I appreciate you having me, and it's always good to talk to you, Richard.
Well, you may be the best, the most well-dressed guest I've had. How's that?
I try. I slept in this actually.
Well, Michael, I've known you for a long time, but one thing I've never asked you is how you went from having a music and physics background to becoming a lawyer.
So it's an interesting question. So I grew up playing music. I started playing violin when I was about 3 years old. I studied violin for a long time. I moved into other instruments, including a serious interest in percussion at a pretty high level. And then in high school, I started to study music composition. And I actually ended up, by the end of high school, I was spending half of the day at my local high school and half of the day at my local music college taking music theory and composition courses. I thought I wanted to go and be a music composer. I'd always had this idea of being a lawyer for various reasons in the back of my mind. And just kind of, as I was getting close to making the college decision, I decided, you know what, I think I don't want to go to a conservatory or a music school. I want to go someplace where I can explore being a lawyer, doing these other things. And I ended up going to Penn State and kind of dropping music. It's always been a part of my life. I still produce music. I produce electronic music. I play piano, but it's solidly been a hobby for me rather than anything more serious.
Well, sometime we'll have to do a later podcast just about that.
Yeah, maybe I'll do a little performance for you. I'm not very good at piano, by the way. I should confess, I'm not a virtuoso.
Well, what about the physics part? How does that play into the legal profession and your specific specialty of blockchain?
Yeah, the physics I think is more relevant, not necessarily in the subject matter, but what I think, in the sense that it's that sort of interest that drew me into blockchain in the first place. So I got to college and I really didn't settle on a major. I thought maybe, engineering of some kind, and I really liked my physics courses. And I discovered that I really like to understand how things work at a very deep level. If you study a lot of science, you study biology, you're dealing with bigger molecules, more complex systems. If you're dealing with chemistry, you deal with, more basic systems. And then, going to physics, you're dealing with just the most basic underlying systems that there are. And like that, there's something about that interests me. So I studied physics. I took a ton of physics classes, had a physics major. And blockchain, I realized kind of piqued my interest in a similar way, where, the way I got into blockchain was a number of years ago when, living in the Bay Area, everyone was talking about cryptocurrency and blockchain going back, years and years. And there was something about it where it just hit me one day, and I said, to understand these conversations, I need to understand this at the most basic level. And everybody has kind of strengths and weaknesses, or certain inclinations. And just sort of some of my strengths and inclinations are just to dig deep and really understand the way things work. So that's what I did with blockchain. And I started with the Bitcoin blockchain, just at the most basic level, trying to understand, what is a blockchain? What is Bitcoin? How does this thing work? What are these terms, cryptography and hashing? What do they mean in this context? And so I don't know how often I use the substantive information that I learned in my physics classes anymore, but it's that underlying kind of need to understand how things work that have served me well in both prior areas of the law and then also here in the blockchain area.
Well, how would you describe blockchain to somebody who's not particularly knowledgeable about it? How would you boil it down to its most basic components?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of the questions I get the most, and my answer has condensed over the years, and I think I got it down to something a little more concise now. So here's the way I describe it: is forget about blockchain for a second. If you think about the world of let's say money, what money is essentially this intangible asset that's tracked digitally, and so what we really have is a system that does two basic things. The system keeps track of how much money you have in an account, And then the system, upon your request, says, okay, you can transfer some amount up to that to somebody else. So if you think about it, your bank account, if you got $1,000 in your bank account, your bank keeps track of how much you have today, and it's the same tomorrow, and it's the same the next day. So that's the first function. And then at your request, your bank will say, okay, I'll transfer $500 from your account to your friend's account, or your account to Best Buy's account for a TV. That's essentially the system of money. So blockchain is, by and large, and this is not entirely true, but by and large, when you talk about the Bitcoin blockchain or the use of blockchains like Ethereum to transfer assets like Ether or the cryptocurrencies, that's essentially what a blockchain is. It's this ledger for keeping track of how many assets people have in their accounts, which are more properly called addresses, and then transferring these imaginary new assets from one address or one account to another address or account. Now, what makes this special? What makes this different than the existing systems? Well, with respect to the existing systems of, let's say, dollars, let's go back to money for a second. This whole system is run by a number of centralized entities, largely banks. Your bank, my bank, other banks, the Federal Reserve, they all keep track of, they're the ones keeping track of how much money everybody has and moving money from one account to another at our request. If you go back, 10, 12 years, particularly in the wake of the subprime mortgage crisis, there were some people who didn't like this system, who had maybe some criticisms of it, among other things. They don't like that banks have so much information about you. They don't like that banks might be subject to hacking. So, the question evolved, is there a way we can create a new system of assets where there are no centralized parties that control this? Everyone who wants to can participate in the running of this ledger just by kind of downloading some software and donating their computer to the enterprise. And that's what a blockchain is. It's just another ledger, except instead of being run by 1, 2, or 5 banks, it's run by tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, all donating their computer to that enterprise. So that's, in a nutshell, what a blockchain is.
So if it weren't for blockchain technology, then cryptocurrencies basically couldn't exist. They couldn't work without it?
I couldn't say whether cryptocurrencies could exist without a distributed ledger, and they call it a distributed ledger. And I think for reasons that I just covered, you can probably understand why. I don't know technologically whether there might be some other way to create. There's certainly ways to create digital currency not using a blockchain. Whether that would be properly called cryptocurrency is probably a matter of nomenclature or convention rather than technology. So you could certainly create digital currency without a blockchain.
Mm-hmm. But blockchain is used, as I understand, a lot more than just currency, right? It's also used for all kinds of other things. Is that right?
Yes and no. So one thing I've found is that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what a blockchain does, what it is, the information in a blockchain, and what it can do. So there are a lot of potential uses of a blockchain, and people talk about things like tracking IP or titles to houses or supply chain and shipping and logistics. And there are maybe people working on those projects. I would say the bulk of the uses for blockchain today are for cryptocurrencies and NFT, like decentralized exchanges, which are very interesting, like some of the decentralized finance or DeFi, as we see. The way I look at it is, blockchains today are maybe a little like the laser, when the laser was invented. When the laser was invented, it was this really amazing new technology. And from a physics standpoint, it's really interesting to understand how a laser works. But at the time, it didn't have a lot of clear, immediate practical uses. People kind of knew it was going to be used for something, but it took a while for these uses for lasers to emerge. And now lasers are used everywhere. We don't even think about it. I think that's probably where we are with blockchain, where there's a lot of people who have a lot of ideas about what blockchain is going to do and can do, and we're kind of in the stage of figuring out what are going to be the uses other than cryptocurrencies, other than NFTs.
Well, you mentioned NFT. What exactly is NFT? Because that is one thing I just cannot wrap my brain around.
Yeah, so if you go back to my original kind of explanation of what a blockchain is, an NFT is just another type of asset that can be tracked. They're kind of an imaginary new asset. So cryptocurrencies are like money. They're fungible and divisible. A I'll give you an example of what that means. If I have $1,000 in my bank account and I put in another dollar, so now I have $1,001, and I go to tell my bank, I say, hey, I want you to send $1 to Richard, but I want it to be the dollar that I last put in, not another dollar. I mean, anyone who knows how banking works and how ledgers work is going to look at you funny and say, that doesn't even make any sense. All we do is keep track of how much of this imaginary asset you have in your account. There's no such thing as this dollar or that dollar. And dollars are divisible. I could send 50 cents to you. That's typically the way cryptocurrencies work. The way non-NFTs or non-fungible tokens work is they're discrete assets and they're tracked individually for the most part. So you can say, okay, I actually see that there's this unique, new, imaginary, intangible asset in my account, and I can transfer it to you, and you can transfer it to somebody else, and you can see the movement of this non-fungible asset all around the blockchain and who owns it currently, as opposed to the movement of these fungible assets. While NFTs could be used for anything, what they're typically used for is they typically contain a link to a piece of media somewhere. It's usually a piece of artwork, digital artwork, or a photograph. It could also be maybe a short video clip or a song. And people started selling these NFTs and saying, okay, I'm going to sell this NFT that's associated with this piece of digital art. And you're going to buy some interest in this piece of digital art that's going to be documented through this NFT as essentially like a certificate of title or of license. And originally, people didn't really think about, well, what does that mean to sell an NFT associated with this piece of media? And from a lawyer's perspective, that doesn't mean much of anything. But once the lawyers got involved, they started to get the idea, well, if you're going to sell this certificate of title or interest in a piece of media, what can you possibly be selling? And the answer that emerges for a lawyer is, well, some type of intellectual property interest, probably a limited license in that piece of artwork or media. So typically what an NFT is if you have an NFT of a picture, you essentially purchased a limited license to display and use that picture for your own personal non-commercial uses. And that interest transfers if you then transfer that NFT to somebody else.
So is it kind of like owning like a limited print or limited copy of an artist's work? Because you don't own the copyright to the underlying work, right? So is it kind of like that?
Yeah, now technically, the interest that you own depends on what the grantor has given you. So it's very possible for me to create a piece of artwork that I own and I own the copyright in, and I can create an NFT and say, whoever owns this NFT, and I'm going to sell it out in the world and it can be resold, whoever owns that, they own the copyright in the thing that I created. That's possible, but more commonly it's, the creator contractually says, I'm going to create an NFT and I'm going to, with that NFT, grant a limited license. So typically you don't get a full copyright with an NFT, you just get a limited license. That is not true in all cases. In some cases you do get a copyright. But it depends on the language used in the grant.
Okay, so when you buy the NFT, there's usually some sort of license grant that comes with it. Is that how it typically works?
Yeah, so typically, and again, in the early days of NFTs, people just sold these NFTs and they didn't think about any of this, and it was unclear what it meant to get an NFT. These days, if you were to go onto a lot of NFT platforms, like Top Shot is a good example, SoRare is a good example, you would see in their terms of service that you accept contractually as a user, they specify what you get as an owner of an NFT. And usually the typical license these days, again, is the ability, a limited license to use for personal, non-commercial use. That seems to be the paradigm that the lawyers have settled on.
Got it. So tell me a little bit, so now with this knowledge you have of blockchain, NFT, and so forth, tell me a little bit how that is integrated into your practice. I'm sure this is more than just an academic interest and stuff. So how does this involve, how does it integrate in your practice?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting journey for me because I'm by practice and by trade and by experience, a litigator. And so for years and years and years, 15 years, I was a litigator, and I developed this interest in blockchain, and simultaneously, we started doing work for a very large cryptocurrency exchange, litigation work. And I just sort of saw the opportunity to build a blockchain practice, first at my prior firm and now continuing on at DLA. And it's taken me into a number of different practice areas because, to focus on an industry area or a technology area like blockchain, it means you start to branch out in your practice areas, because my expertise is really in the technology, in the industry, in the way that all sorts of different laws, securities laws, commodities laws, now commercial terms in NFTs and intellectual property laws apply, to this new technology. And so that means I end up doing more commercial work. I do a lot of deal work, particularly for NFT platforms. I do securities counseling for cryptocurrency issuers typically, and sometimes exchanges. And so it really becomes, anytime anyone needs advice and counseling about NFTs generally, I'm usually just one of the first people they reach out to at the firm. Same with cryptocurrency. And I've just sort of been able to broaden the practice areas that I can reach with this knowledge.
What are some of the things that are litigated? What are some of the issues that are actually litigated?
Yeah, so there's a few different buckets of what are getting litigated these days in the blockchain space. So number one is obviously, blockchain companies, whether they're cryptocurrency exchanges or issuers or NFT platforms, they can get into just the same sorts of litigation that anybody else gets involved in. A trademark dispute, and I'm defending a big trademark dispute now for a cryptocurrency issuer. Employment dispute. But the blockchain specific litigation, there's a few different flavors that we see a decent amount. So number one is account takeovers. And this is pretty prevalent generally in the online account space. It's true for banks. It's something that happens to online stock brokerages, where all of these institutions and the financial institutions and cryptocurrency exchanges, they've gotten pretty difficult to hack. It's hard to hack into a bank. The point of weakness is usually at the customer level. And so what you see a lot more commonly are what are called account takeovers, where customers individually or en masse are kind of duped with a phishing scam into giving over account credentials, and then have their assets from various financial institutions essentially, stolen. And so banks, stock brokerages, cryptocurrency exchanges, and I think shortly NFT platforms find themselves involved in a decent amount of those disputes. The other hot area that we see emerging is in the securities field, because increasingly there are a growing number of cryptocurrencies and digital assets, including NFTs, being traded on public platforms in the United States, and they're generally not registered as securities. They're not trading on platforms that are registered to trade securities. And the question arises particularly from plaintiffs' attorneys, who I will not characterize on this podcast, but are any of these securities? And so you're starting to see probably less from regulators, but more from private plaintiffs' attorneys pushing and saying, hey, can we make a case in a class action that this cryptocurrency was actually a security, and we can sue the issuer for an unregistered offering? I don't think these cases have seen a lot of success. I think there's a lot of reasons why they're not likely to see success. I'm not a fan of them for a number of reasons, but I do think that there is a trend where we are starting to see some more of that.
Tell me about the book that you recently wrote on this space, in this area.
So I'd be overselling my credit if I said I wrote the whole book. So essentially, my colleague Deborah Mishulam and I were co-editors of the book. The book is called Cryptocurrency and Digital Asset Regulation, a Practical Guide for Counsel. It was published by the ABA. And we essentially edited an 8-chapter book. We wrote 3 or 4 of the chapters. And the chapters are each on a different area of law as applied to cryptocurrency. So we've got and blockchain and digital assets. So we've got a chapter on securities and how the securities laws apply to blockchain-based assets. We have a chapter on tax and how tax laws are applied to blockchain-based assets, a chapter on commodities, a chapter on the money laundering laws. And so, again, we wrote 3 of the chapters, and then we worked with authors, some of which are in our firm, our colleagues Margot Tank and Andrew Grant, as well as some colleagues from Morgan Lewis, from Orrick, and from Navigant. And we each kind of contributed our own chapters and our expertise, and then Deborah and I edited the book.
So is the book for lawyers? Is it more for in-house lawyers? Is it more for outside counsel? What would you say?
I think it's mostly for lawyers who are practicing in the space. There are a lot of great books out there on blockchain and the law. One, by the way, written by my old friend Aaron Wright, which is a phenomenal book. Another written by my friend Drew Hinkes. These are great books. I think a lot of them are maybe geared for a larger population. What we really wanted to do with this book is say, okay, if you're a lawyer practicing in this space, and number one, you really need to understand how blockchain-based assets work, a longer explanation of what I gave earlier on the podcast. And then you really need to know how securities laws apply in this space, or you really need to know how the sanctions laws apply in this space. That's the guide we wanted to give. So something more practical for lawyers who are practicing in this space. I don't think non-lawyers are going to benefit from much of the book. And if you're not a lawyer practicing in this space, you might be interested in how tax laws or commodities laws are applied, but it's really for the practitioner in the space, or who's just jumping into the space, or maybe doesn't have a lot of experience in the space, but needs to assist the client in one of these areas.
Well, Michael, this has been a terrific conversation, and I really appreciate your actually explaining blockchain and NFT to me, and I knew that you'd be the right person to do it. So it's been great talking to you, and I certainly wish you all the best.
Well, Richard, again, thank you so much. It's always good to talk to you. It's been an absolute honor to be on the podcast, and looking forward to the next one.
This is Richard Hsu and Michael Fluhr. Thanks.